George Floyd case was a great example of, we're seeing this in use of force things and other things where they can point back to, I did that because that's how I was trained. You can expect a lawsuit when there's a problem. It's not just about what is in the manual, but also there needs to be some responsibility of, yes, we're going to teach that, but we're also going to fix that because we can't have that examiner up there having learned something bad or something the wrong way.
Hey there, my name's Ashley Church.
And I'm Erin West.
We were once newly promoted crime scene and latent print supervisors on mutual struggle buses as we both simultaneously tried to navigate through the challenges within our forensic units.
Now we run a business where we create tools and resources that we wish we had had to make these transitions easier. We like to talk about the experiences we've had in the forensic field, the good, the bad, and the ugly, in the hopes to create awareness around these issues and move the needle forward to create positive change in the forensic community.
So if you're a forensic professional, regardless of your years of experience, who's not afraid to dive into real, raw, and sometimes uncomfortable topics, you're in the right place.
This is the Forensics Unfiltered podcast.
How's it going? Did you happen to catch the solar eclipse earlier this week? Erin actually is teaching in Northport, Florida, but they did have one student that brought the special glasses, so they all were able to see the solar eclipse. I also was able to see the solar eclipse with our children, but we were not in the path of total totality, but I can tell you it was still so cool to witness. Today's episode is pretty cool. We got to invite the hosts of the DOUBLELOOP podcast. We're sure you've heard of it before. We were actually a guest on the DOUBLELOOP podcast. Check it out, episode 258. And now we get to invite Eric and Glenn on Forensics Unfiltered. What's so cool about this episode is we recorded it in front of a live audience. And this was part of an extra bonus that we had during the Forensic Trainer Symposium for anyone that upgraded to the Masterclass experience. Now, if you missed out on the Forensic Trainer Symposium or weren't able to catch all of the presentations, you can still find the Masterclass experience on our website. Head to gapscience.teachable.com. I'll also include it in the show notes, and you can catch all of the replays for the Forensic Trainer Symposium presentations. Now, I will warn you ahead of time. This was a really great conversation. It was so good that it was over an hour long. So I have chopped it up into 2 parts. So you'll get to hear the first part on this episode, and you'll have to wait for the second part next week. I know I'm going to be leaving you hanging in suspense, but I'm telling you now, you're not going to want to miss a minute of this week and next week. So without further ado, here is the interview with Glenn and Eric from the DOUBLELOOP podcast. Before we start this episode, our guests would like to share a disclaimer that the opinions shared are their own and not representative of their current or past employment. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Well, welcome back, guys. We have a very special episode for you. This is actually a first of its kind for us, where we have a live audience. We're coming to you from the Forensic Trainer Symposium. We just wrapped up day 1. So Erin started us out with scoring your training program. We also got to hear from Danielle and Mary about competency tests and mock trials. Dr. Heidi Seaver made an appearance with crafting exercises for maximum impact. We also had Ashley Rosales talk about how to document training's performance, even when you don't have a training program. And then the last presentation of the day was setting the stage with the FTO must-dos before the first training lesson with Heather Temple. And Erin, we also had 2 live workshops today too, right?
Yes, we did. They were very awesome for those of you that got to attend them. So I was in the workshop with Gabby. Gabby was talking about mental health for our trainees and how we can stop passing our bad habits on to our trainees. So that was a really great workshop. And then Ashley was in the other one.
Yes. So we we were riding the struggle bus and we had a FTO team challenge on how to get your trainee off of the struggle bus. So there's 10 bus stops that they had to get their trainee off of. So lots of engaging discussions. We were literally like having discussions right up until just minutes before the workshops were ending. So I think everyone really enjoyed that. But tonight we are diving in with Glenn and Eric from the Double Loop podcast. We're really excited to have them on the Forensics Unfiltered podcast and get some discussions going about training programs in general.
Awesome. So before we dive into all of the questions that everyone has prepared for this evening, Glenn and Eric, can you tell us a little bit about yourselves for those who don't know you, who would not know you though, and also a little bit about the Double Loop and what they can find there?
Sure. So my name is Eric Ray. I'm a certified latent print examiner, and I worked for the state of Arizona and then Ideal Innovations for about 12 years as a latent print examiner. And now I work for IDEMIA as a subject matter expert with the APHIS company. So for about over 10 years now, Glenn and I have co-hosted the Double Loop podcast. So it's our podcast talking about friction-ridge fingerprint topics, court cases, but also forensics in general, true crime cases, lots of different things. And it's been great, growing that podcast from just our tiny start to now, getting feedback from examiners all over the world about, listening to us and finding stuff of interest in the stuff we talk about.
And for those I've not met, which actually probably quite a few, Aaron and Ashley, because especially with crime scene, like I don't get a lot of access to often crime scene specialists, so there might actually be quite a few. So I'm just going to say hello to everybody. Happy hour. I take my happy hour seriously, so I
Yes.
do have happy hour. A couple of people's cameras popped on their phones and whatnot, so I see some people are working out or running or whatever. So that's fine. Enjoy this time. But I'm Glenn Langenburg. I've been a fingerprint examiner for 20 plus years now. 24 years and now, wow, a quarter of a century almost. And when I started out, I actually also started in crime scenes. So I did crime scenes for about 9 years and probably a good 3 to 4 solid, lots of crime scenes every month or so. I worked for the state crime lab, so we didn't respond to anything except for homicides. So I'm not like some of you that respond to multiple crime scenes in a week. We would do one every 4 to 6 weeks, but it would always be a homicide, and it'd be usually very serious and large scale scenes. I won't say that I miss it. Because I definitely don't miss those calls at night. And I think many people assume that the worst call is the 2 or 3 in the morning call. No, it's the 10 p.m. call, because you have just closed your eyes hoping to get 3 or 4 hours of sleep. And I do not miss that call. That 10 p.m. call was the worst. But I do miss the aspects of crime scene, the puzzle solving, the challenge. It was always something different, and I did enjoy that part of it. And I'm kind of excited to talk about some crime scene aspects tonight as well.
It always ate into happy hour too. That was always not a good time.
Yes, that's right. Or you couldn't go to the happy hour because you were on call.
That's true.
Oh, I'll go
Once
for
you're
one
there,
drink.
once you're at the happy hour, there's no more homicides for you tonight. Once you make it there.
And I guess if I didn't get this out, like Eric works for an independent, company. I now work for myself. I left the state crime lab a few years back now and have been self-employed, have my own consulting company. So I get to see and review both fingerprint crime scene cases from all over the country, different jurisdictions, and very likely somewhere in this audience looked at some cases in your jurisdiction. And that, to me, has been the best part of my job, is seeing all the variation and sometimes really good work out there and sometimes really poor work out there. It is such a vast array that you see. And boy, every agency is so different in how they approach things. And again, some are great and fantastic and others are very lacking.
Yeah, we haven't been around the block as long as you guys, but that's definitely kind of the gist that we see as we're teaching people across the U.S. as well. The vast difference is it's a very wide gap.
Yeah. Yeah, if anything, I'm hopeful that I'll be able to speak to a few things that, I think can be corrected at the examiner level. I think there are some things that are beyond, the examiner, things that are just out of their control, things that often like, will we become accredited, or will we get more staff, or caseload and things like that. That's often beyond the control of the examiner, but there are things that the examiner can do to help control their own destiny and some of the outcomes of these cases.
And this is why we like chatting with you guys so much, because we like to dive into the risque topics as well. So,
Sure.
Erin, you want to kick us off with
The
first
risque topics.
question?
Here we come.
I love it.
All right. So you guys, and just to say, I had no idea that Double Loop had been around for a whole decade. That's
Happy 10
That's
years.
a lot of topics you guys have talked about over the years. So
It really is.
all right. Well, tonight we've already had some of our lovely guests here submit some questions. So we're going to go through some of those. And then, of course, all of you guys that are here live, we know that you guys want to rapid fire some questions as well. So we're going to go through maybe one or two of the ones that have been posted, and then we'll open the floor for a few from you guys, and we'll kind of go back and forth between the questions that have been submitted, and then also letting you guys rapid fire our little panel here. So let's start with a scandalous one, shall we?
That is definitely on brand for us.
Let's dive right in. Yes. Okay. So someone asks, my department is way behind the times and I know it. We all know it. They have made me a trainer. Do I teach more current stuff that I've learned, or do I use the old dusty training program? So we'll pass it to you guys first. Eric and Glenn, what are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, I can definitely see this happening and being very easy to happen, right? So much stuff changes in such a short time period, or can, that it's a challenge for agencies to keep up sometimes. So it's understandable how you get into that situation. I remember going to teach like sworn officers or in like academy kind of training environments. There was a specific curriculum of what you had to get across in the time you were training them. And that may have been written like 15 years ago. So I think the best approach here is really giving your trainee that context. This is what you need to know. This is why, hopefully you have that background. This is why things were taught this way, or this is why it was written this way. Here's now the kind of the modern take on it, why the community is moving in this direction instead. Like just giving them that full picture, right? So that if you're asked by the supervisor, this is the answer that you give. In practice, this is what you should be doing. Here in our agency, we have these policies. Here's how you stay within the policies, and here's how you still produce good work that's going to stand up in court. That's going above and beyond the policies, right? I think it's just that context of the entire situation and getting them up to speed as to where things are at and why.
I agree completely. But the only thing I can add to that is usually when there's the original documents and when Eric's talking about kind of changes or things going on in the field, it's usually added on to. In other words, yes, you have to teach what is in the manual because that might be the rules of the agency. And in order to get that examiner to competency, they have to meet whatever is in that manual. But that doesn't mean you can't add more to it. And very rarely is the manual much more specific than some of the things out there. And people only add to, they never take away from. So adding on those other things, like meeting those things, and then adding, and by the way, this, and by the way, this, and hey, we had a case a couple of years ago, you should probably know about this and that. And I think the only time that you're going to run into a real issue is when the manual says, this is how you answer this question in court, or say this, or here's how you write it in your report. And 10 years ago, that has been determined by the community that if you say that, you're going to get in lots of trouble, or you're going to cause problems in the court system, or something's going to get rejected. The thing like I'm thinking in fingerprints, what we call the zero error rate answer, or the, to the exclusion of all other statements. So I think that there are definitely things that examiners need to be aware of and point out, like, yes, our manual says this, and you should know this internally, but if you go into the courtroom and say this, you could be causing all kinds of problems. And this is an issue of course, and here's where I'm going to push it. It's going to get a little controversial, because I think at that point, it is the responsibility of the trainer to do something about that. You can't put your trainees in the line of fire and just go, oh, we're just following orders. You have to go to the management and say, we need to change this. This is not right. And here's all the reasons. And it might be the entire manual, but if you can't put your examiner at risk on the stand, I would argue, and look, we're seeing this in a George Floyd case was a great example of it. We're seeing this in use of force things and other things where they can point back to, I did that because that's how I was trained. You can expect a lawsuit when there's a problem. So, I mean, there has to be this issue of, it's not just about what is in the manual, but also there needs to be some responsibility of, yes, we're going to teach that, but we're also going to fix that, because we can't have that examiner up there and possibly, under fire for having learned something bad or something the wrong way.
Yeah, and I do feel like we do teach a lot of field training officers, and a lot of field training officers are voluntold. But we do tap into the seriousness that this is a leadership position. And like you said, you don't get to choose complacency anymore. Yeah. There is a certain level of something that you have to do about it. The only thing I would add to this question, because they're saying that their agency does stuff in a very old fashion. What we also find, and this is also leading into some touchy topics, is usually the agencies that are following very, very old, dusty, crusty ways, most likely they don't have SOPs. Maybe they'll have general orders, but usually they don't have standard operating procedures. Most likely they don't have a training program. So I'm not suggesting to go against what your agency does, but also if they don't have these documents that you have to abide by, then I do feel like you have some wiggle room there as well. And again, I'm not trying to tell you to go against your supervisor's orders and get yourself in trouble. But if you don't have written standard operating procedures, there's nothing to say that you have to follow it this way that your agency does it, because there's nothing written to tell you otherwise.
Yeah.
That's my take on it.
So true. All right. How about you guys that are all listening here? So we definitely want you guys to be able to interact. So as we're talking about these things, please feel free to drop in the chat box. Does anybody have a crusty, dusty old training program that they are being forced to train from?
Oh, and especially if they know something's wrong in it. Does anyone have a really good example of, look, this is in the manual and we are being told that we have to train this and we know that it's wrong or going to cause problems? That's an interesting question that popped up there. Are there areas that you wish trainees would see more training on outside of subject matter expertise? There's one that pops into mind right away, and it's such an obvious one, but really is shocking, is that many forensic professionals lack an understanding of the legal system. I mean, even if they are actually sworn personnel, doesn't mean they actually understand the court system, things like discovery or some of the case law, or why are we have to do this way or why you have to testify that way. I actually was very lucky. My program at Michigan State University was for all intents and purposes, an undergraduate in chemistry with an undergraduate in pre-law. And so we had to take 3 years of legal courses. We had to take criminal law, civil rights, amendment law, contract law. You have to learn all of these different things about the legal system. And I will tell you, it has served me really well today, because I can read these documents. I understand the cases. I can go to those cases. I can understand legal decisions and why judges are saying this or that. It's actually really helpful. And I'm surprised how many forensic professionals are really, if they learn anything about the criminal justice system, they learn from who? From their trainer, who's not a legal person. They tend to get trained about the criminal justice system from non-legal people. And I think it would be very beneficial.
You might think this as well, but we've seen a lot of training programs don't even include anything like a moot court or a mock trial or any kind of training for preparation to testify at all.
Yep.
So, I mean, I know at our department, we had to add that to the training program that already existed, because we see a lot of, and throughout our travels throughout the United States, we see a lot of departments that don't include that as part of their training at all.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you think that would be a pretty vital component of a training program.
Well, yeah, and not, again, not just coming from other forensic professionals, but from attorneys. I mean, you know, again, if you can get like a local prosecutor or defense attorney to come and talk about these things, why is chain of custody important to the legal system? You know, what is discovery? What's the difference between discovery versus disclosure, which are two different things? Which things must be disclosed and which ones must be discovered? I mean, all of these kinds of things, and legal precedent and case law, that's all really important that most forensic professionals are. I look at it as just like a giant wave, and they're just swept up in it, and they just kind of go along with the flow, but they really don't understand why it's happening.
Love that. Haley says she's testified once in 9 years and has 2 trials coming up in the spring, and she really wished she had had more than a 3-day class on it.
Yeah,
For sure.
Sorry, Haley, that sucks.
Just keep swimming. Okay, so another question we had is, should a training program coincide with the trainee's probationary period? We have a 12-month probationary period, and we outsource fingerprinting and crime scene trainings. I'm afraid that due to the outsourcing, we are not giving them enough time to gauge if the trainee should be cut or not, or would it make cutting them after 12 months more difficult?
Yeah, that's tough. I think in general, especially, okay, so this is more going to be a latent print answer, but what I feel is that the comparison portion of latent print work is the long pole in the tent, right? It's what's going to take the most time to build up that eye of when to make the call for an ID, and probably even more difficultly, when to draw the line of, I'm going to stop looking because I don't think it's here. That's a hard line to learn. So there seems to be a trend overall in latent prints, especially, this is again assuming you're in an agency where the latent print examiner also does their own processing and photography, of starting with processing and photography and then building up to comparisons. I think it has to be the other way around, because if they're not going to cut it as a comparison examiner, and if that's what they're being trained to do, then you need as much time as possible to see that they can't make that. And hopefully after whatever the probationary period is, you can start to see, hey, they're falling behind, they're not where we expect them to be. They're still struggling with even the medium difficulty ones, because they're doing it the opposite way of, okay, getting them up and they're fully off and running, doing processing and photography after 6 months. All right, now let's start off on comparisons. You may not have enough time to tell. Now, how that kind of works out with outsourcing, that's really tough. But maybe, I don't think the training can really necessarily fit within a department's probationary period, but you should have some sort of plan for, this is a probationary period that's going to be set by department policy. So what can we do in that time frame to tell? It's not going to be a complete training program all the way to the end necessarily, but we should be able to tell something by the end of this time period.
I love that idea.
That's a great answer.
Our training program is built that way, where they do the processing and everything first. And we 100% have had people be in the program for months and months and months and months and months before we can figure out that they can't do comparisons. That is a great idea. I may implement that myself.
I used to make this point by saying anyone can be trained to process. I now know that's not true.
Experience has told you otherwise.
Experience has taught me otherwise, but that's okay. But it tends to not take as long. So that's my revised answer.
And I agree with Eric. Same thing. We had a similar situation in our lab where it was processing first because they wanted to get them signed off on that, and then you would get to the comparisons, 6 to 9 months in, and we did have a 1 year cutoff for probation. Now we were a union laboratory, what that meant was that effectively as a union hire, you have this probationary period of 1 year where you could let them go without cause, which is if you had any reason to suspect this is not going to work out, you really didn't have to justify it. You could simply say, nope, that's it. And you could, without any repercussions, they could be let go, which you had to have legitimate concern, but that's how that worked. Doesn't mean you can't fire them after the 1 year, but why would you want to go a year of investment of the time, money, and everything if they're not going to work out? So we most definitely tried to figure out what tasks in every section have the most cognitive load. And like Eric said, there's comparisons, right, for most of the pattern disciplines. But, if you're a crime scene, that might simply be the ability to communicate and work with other agencies, to coordinate different things, to do it in a meaningful way. Maybe photography is the most difficult task at the crime scene. Maybe it's documentation, whatever that might be. Because again, every agency is different. Some people don't do bloodstain pattern analysis at a crime scene, so they don't have to worry about that part of pattern at a scene. Again, maybe the most challenging thing is simply documentation. Maybe it's thinking outside the box. Maybe it's following SOPs. But you have to figure out what the most difficult tasks are, especially the ones that not everyone's brain is set up for, and figure out if they can do this early on. You need to set tests or metrics or things. Even if you're outsourcing some of it, you still need to have these things where they come back from that outsourced training or whatever and make sure along the way that they're doing this. And that, again, the biggest one just tends to be interpersonal relationships. If they're not working with people within your agency, you're not going to figure out what kind of fit they are. And I'm thinking of a couple of small agencies in California that do crime scenes. That was their biggest hurdle, was just getting these people out at scenes, civilian working with sworn officers. How do they interact in the field? How do they take instruction? How do they give instruction? Those are all very complicated things. You can't wait a year into that process. It's not fair to you. It's not fair to them. It's not fair to anyone. You have to figure out where those chokeholds are very early on, get right in there and see if they can do that.
I really love this perspective, actually, and it's something that I hadn't even considered. And I feel like, as far as crime scene goes, and I wish I had known this, because I was like, oh, this is kind of genius. Definitely photography. That's a big one. But I think the other thing that either crime scene units neglect to have as part of their training program, or they wait until the very end, is absolutely report writing.
Great point.
And testifying. So some don't even have testifying as part of their training program. They don't test in it within the probationary year, and that's your end product. So you can do everything else nice and wrap it up in a bow, but if you can't testify, then this job isn't for you. So just making me rethink, absolutely, actually report writing should be probably something that you are looking into well and towards the beginning of the training program, and don't wait until the end to tap into those meat and potato, is what we say, meat and potato type of topics or skills. Because as you mentioned, especially in union states, we weren't in a union state. We could get extensions on the probation if we wanted to, a lot more easily probably than you. But the time is ticking. So if you have 12 months, you better use your time wisely to make sure that they're hitting the bar. Otherwise, like you said, it's not fair to them. It's not fair to you. You can't just keep extending the training program, 2-3 years. That's entirely too long to figure out if someone's cut out for this.
Yeah, if I could add one more thing to it, because it just triggered a memory. I remember we hired this one person that from the get-go, I was a naysayer. I was like, I don't think this person's really going to work out. But they really wanted her because she would be willing to go work in one of our divisions and areas in the state that not a lot of people were willing to go to. So I think they were willing to overlook some deficiencies in her, just because she'd be willing to basically move to a place no one wanted to. And what I kept pointing out very clearly was she lacked attention to detail and focus. And I would give example after example, because I would just sit there and kind of watch her from across the room. And I'd see her look at the computer, work on something for a little bit, and immediately like her phone would ding and she'd pick it up and go right to the phone. And then 30 seconds later, she'd go back to the phone, and then back to the phone, and back to the phone. And I just kept looking at that going, that is a bad combination for this job. If you cannot sit uninterrupted and focus on something. And of course, what was the problem? A lack of attention to detail in her work. Those are things that you have to sit and observe, and you have to kind of have those interactions to go, boy, this is a recipe for disaster. She did eventually fail out of the program, but it was past the probationary period, and it took a very long time.
We all know after that, it's going to take a lot more effort.
Yes.
Just to build one more thing on this, I would say if your probationary period is a year, you don't actually have a year, right? You have only 9 months or so, because you've got to figure out what the problem is, and that attention to detail thing is it's going to be across every discipline. But you have to figure it out, and now then, as a trainer, communicate that to the trainee, so that they can, hopefully recognize the deficiency and improve. Yeah. And if you're not doing that, well, then there's just no point, because the problem isn't, it's like, oh, geez, our trainees keep, failing out because they can't do documentation. Well, I mean, after so many trainees all fail to do documentation, maybe the problem is the training program isn't teaching them effectively to do documentation. So you need to, again, identify the problem earlier than the probationary period, give them an opportunity to correct course, fix what the problem is, and hopefully that works out and then they can proceed. Not just, hey, your 12 months is up, turns out you can't document, and then they're looking around going, well, why didn't anyone tell me?
Yeah. That is something I learned the hard way, where I waited until 2 weeks before the time period was due, and learn the hard way that you don't wait until that long. So listen to Eric, follow his advice. Like he said, at least by 9 months, you need to figure out some remediation plan, because that's going to take a lot of time and documentation and thoughts, and give the trainee time to fix the problem and do all of the communication up and down the chain. So absolutely. Take that tip from Eric and learn that lesson before you learn it the hard way like I did.
So one more, add on to this, a common theme that's come up multiple times just today is another skill that seems to be a struggle is just general problem solving. And specifically for our crime scene people, because they work in a little bit more of a gray area where every single case they work is a little bit different. So they have to take information they've learned and previous cases they've worked and extrapolate what they're supposed to do in this case here. And we've had a lot of people talking today about having trainees that have a difficulty of well, this one's a little bit different and I haven't worked something just like this. What do I do now? And they're just kind of frozen in that decision process, where those of us that, work in latents, someone in here is in firearms, things like that. It's maybe a little bit more black and white. We kind of do the same process every time. So would you kind of put that problem solving as one of those things as well? Kind of the ability to work in that gray area a little bit more?
Critical thinking. I mean, that's really, it's one of the things I really look for. So I used to do, a lot of hiring and interviewing, and I was known for asking very challenging questions during the interview. Some that people sometimes would cry during the interview, but all I would ask is, great, you said, I would ask things like, would you consider yourself, strong in critical thinking? Of course, everyone's going to say yes. My next question was, great. Give me an example of where you did that. Give me an example where you did some critical thinking, but your previous supervisor didn't listen to you or didn't believe you. These are the kinds of things I would like to try to pull out, because I would often look for hard, realistic examples of someone who can demonstrate that they actually have critical thinking skills. And boy, I mean, this is old man Glenn here. There has been a drop off of critical thinking. I remember when I first started doing interviews, 20 years ago, and then just watching that it's not being reinforced in college, I think, in some classes, and it's really important. It's a disservice to, I think, some of the young people coming out of college today to not be forced to critically think.
Yeah. Well, just to put a nugget in all of y'all's ears, Miss Alice White is doing a presentation on Wednesday morning just about that.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Really?
she talks about how to create like critical thinking interview questions so that you can fish out really good candidates. So if
I
you
knew it
need
was a
help with
genius
that,
answer.
that presentation will be for you. Yeah, so let's go to Matt's question here. This is a really good question, and I think that a lot of agencies have this struggle. So he said, if you don't have SOPs, do you go about creating some based off the standards that are in the field and then just operate off of them without them actually being official at your department?
Oh, Eric, come on.
Woo.
This one's good for you.
Come on, Eric.
Eric and I just
okay.
recently went through this.
So I think that.
All right, I'm going to cut it right there. I know some of you are probably so angry with me right now. I'm so sorry. But just make sure you tune in next week to Forensics Unfiltered. I promise I will be posting the second half of the interview next week. If you are liking this so far, make sure to rate the podcast, subscribe to Forensics Unfiltered, leave us a comment, and let us know exactly what you liked about this episode and what you'd like to hear more about. Have a great week, everybody. Stay safe. Thank you so much for being here and listening to Forensics Unfiltered. If you liked this episode, would you do us a favor and leave a review letting us know specifically what you liked about this topic? It will only take a minute, but it will really help us plan future episodes so we can bring you more topics that you want to listen to. We'll be sure to provide any links from today's episode in our show notes on our website. Head to www.gapscience.com. Until next time, stay safe out there.